Welcome to the China Source webinar. We're glad that you could join us. My name is Joanne Pittman, and I'll be the moderator for this webinar. I'm the Senior Vice President of China Source. Before joining China Source, I worked in China as a teacher, program director, and cross-cultural trainer. The presenter for tonight's webinar is Dr. Mary Lee Ma, a research fellow at the Henry Institute of Christianity and Public Life at Calvin University. She's a frequent guest editor of the China Source Quarterly and the author of numerous books about Christianity in China. For those of you unfamiliar with China Source, we offer insight and analysis for the global church to deepen understanding about the complexities and multidimensional nature of the church in China. We do this through our online publications, consultations, training, and consulting services. We also seek to be a place where the global church can hear directly from Chinese Christians about the situation and challenges in China, thereby giving a chance for the global church to learn from our brothers and sisters in China. We currently serve over 20,000 readers per month with information about the church in China through our website, emails, and various social media platforms. You can learn more by visiting our website, chinasource.org. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items that we would like to attend to. First of all, please check that your audio is working. All participants will be muted. Only the moderator and presenter will be heard during this webinar. Please submit your your questions via the chat function. They will not be visible to other participants. They will only be visible to the administrator. Please do not take screenshots of the slides. Following the webinar, you will retain access to a recorded version on Webinar Jam. You'll receive instructions following the conclusion of the webinar on how to access those. We would also like to take this time to learn a little bit more about our audience by means of a poll. Please take a few seconds to answer the current poll about my main current involvement with China and the Chinese church is. So if you can just take about 10 seconds to answer those questions. Thank you. Now we're going to move on to the presentation. Thank you, Mary, for being here to offer your analysis and insight on the life of Christians in China today. I'm confident that we're going to learn a lot.
Thank you, Joanne, for the introduction of this time, and thank you all for participating, and I hope my presentation in the next hour or so will be helpful to you. First, I would like to start with this photo image, which I used for the cover of my first book. It is a skyline of a Chinese city. It has a statue of Mao, a cross, and in fact, a casino and a science museum in the background. I like this image because it neatly captures some key cultural components of today's China. It's official communism, Christianity, consumerism, and technology. In today's China, Christians live in a cultural milieu of revived communist nationalistic sentiments, but also a consumeristic urbanism and the convenience and noises provided by social media and technology. Their loves, fears, and desires are not unaffected by these cultural parameters. In the following presentation, I will talk about three parts. I will first start with China's changing tolerance of Christian growth, and part two will be about living as Christian communities in an urbanizing China, and part three will be about walking the narrow path in a tighter China. So part one is mainly a historical overview, and I want to emphasize that this is a foundational part on which I build my part two and three of my presentation. For this reason, I plan to use more time on part one and then maybe less time on part two and three. And please be reminded that there are also overlapping themes across these three parts. I think it's really important to know the historical trajectory, which show the importance, what I call socioeconomic structural parameters. And I hope that the one takeaway that you can have from today's presentation is this line of my main point here. The growth of churches in China and the lives of Christians today have been embedded in the political as well as socioeconomic structural changes since 1949. This is a trend map. It is a rough estimation of growth trend, not based on exact statistics, because that is largely impossible to obtain. The purpose of this graph is to show how growth fluctuates with key turning points in recent Chinese history. Indeed, China is still under a communist regime, but to be more specific, there has been 4 qualitatively different phases of communism that shaped the lives of Christians in China. We have to know that preceding 1949, China was once the world's largest mission center, with missionary-founded schools, colleges, hospitals, and other institutions. But after the founding of the Chinese communist regime, we know that China entered a different phase. These colleges and schools and institutions were nationalized and then abolished. The key turning point was the US-Korea War, which triggered strong anti-foreign campaigns. Church leaders who wanted no foreign control began the Three Self-patriotic movement. And then, on the economic level, land reforms restructured rural China and eradicated the local gentry class. There are many waves of political movements that we're familiar with, and there was Mao's Cultural Revolution when even the Three Self churches were closed down. So this was an intense period of total war against Christianity, because only Maoism was considered a de facto politicized religion enforced by the state. It is important to know that the dominant forms of socioeconomic structures during this time was rural communes and urban work units, locking individuals into strict grids that were easy to monitor. In other words, there was very little space for people to freely assemble, including the family home space. So this image of total war against Christianity is a familiar one to us, I think. It was an intense phase of persecution, which left a collective memory on one whole generation of Christians in China. And also because of this, the traditional house churches became a very much respected one among the older generation. This has also shaped the way how church leaders later interact with authorities. And we know that in the 1870s, the ending of the Cultural Revolution marked transition to the next phase for China. Phase 2, I call it pragmatic communism. The regime made a pragmatic turn towards economic liberalization in the 80s, which means opening up and reform. Here on this trend map, there's word decollectivization. It means the disintegration of rural communes and collective farming. The central planning system gradually gave way to market structures. And also during this time, many church leaders were released from prison and started to gather small groups of believers in their home space. But the urban work unit system, which is also called danwei, was still there, prohibiting large scales of assembly beyond home gathering groups. And the stigma of being Christians was still there. State surveillance continued, and churches recruited members by relying mainly on high-trust, close-knit networks. Missionaries could come into China on short-term visas. But all these sporadic efforts and truncated spiritual coaching resulted in a new generation of Christian converts who embraced a new faith but were also cut off from continued mentorship. And these people were expected to lead others. We have to also know that after 1987 that Bible printing was considered legal. So that was a turning point. Before that, families or churches sometimes need to borrow the only copy in that community. And after it was legal to purchase and own Bibles, the stigma of being Christians was kind of dealt with. And after this, we know that there was Tiananmen, followed by a wave of mass conversion in the next decades. And by the mid to late 90s, urban work unit system also disintegrated. Many state-owned enterprises, known as SOEs, had big layoffs. There was less surveillance and more space for urban residents. Growing market economy and free entrepreneurship also created new commercial space for urban evangelism. Many of today's church leaders converted during this time. With the expansive growth since the late 90s, new believers soon needed to become leaders to even newer converts, like 5-year-olds trying to raise 1-year-olds. Mature leadership has been lacking in churches, and meanwhile, attrition rate has been high too. And also in the late 90s, mission organizations entered into college campuses through international student exchange programs. And all the way through the early 2000s, college cafeteria and McDonald's became publicly sheltered space for discipleship training and faith-related conversations to happen. Also during this time, mass migration brought rural believers into urban centers. I will talk about this in part 2. And phase 3 is what I call developmental communism. A key turning point which started this phase was the fact that in 2004, private property rights were rewritten into the Chinese constitution. Soon afterwards, urban housing market boomed. More commercial space opened up. Churches can lease or own properties. Many church groups moved into more spacious commercial apartments or office buildings. So personally, I think on an observational level, churches normally grew from a dozen to 100 some members in just 3 to 4 years. So this is a period of very fast growth. With the growth in sizes, churches are also showing collective identities. Compared to the 90s, when many churches were named after founders, like Auntie Wang's or Uncle Joe's, since the mid-2000s, they were taking on names that differentiate themselves from each other, such as Livingstone Church, Streamside Church, Little Land Church, etc. And China's further opening up during this phase also saw more international travel and exchange. Many highly educated Chinese became Christians overseas, including some specialized professionals, such as scientists, economists, artists, etc. These people were later served by returnee ministries, but they all face similar challenges. People who converted overseas have a difficult time in adapting to church life in China. Most times, their expectations are not aligned with reality, and the reality of churches in China is that there has been a lack of pastoral resources and mature leadership to care for these specialized professionals. For example, I know a group of Christian artists who founded a church and invited a preacher to lead it. But over the years, these artists heard more and more from the pulpit that art is secular and unimportant to evangelism. They're discouraged and marginalized. The same thing happened to many Christian scientists and economists too. They could become misfit in urban churches. So it is very difficult for them to live a very nurturing church life. And the efforts to form some kind of loose fellowship networks for these groups were just budding. And the turning point for this exciting, fast-growing phase to end, I think, was after the Beijing Olympics. Because we know that this event kind of culminated China's nationalistic pride and became a watershed year for later restrictive changes. Next, we move on to phase 4, which I call anti-associationism. Around 2012 or 14, China has entered into a different phase. By this word, I refer to the regime's purpose to maintain social stability by limiting the scale of assembly in an age of increased rights awareness and rising social inequality. And we know that since 2014, even many Three Self churches experienced a setback with the cross removal campaigns in 1 or 2 provinces. But these changes also need to be placed back into China's urban renewal and demolition projects, because we know demolition-related disputes peaked in China during this time, not just related to church buildings. And nationalistic sentiments among the public also fueled many anti-Christmas campaigns, with young people dressed in Chinese traditional gowns and holding up the slogan, "Chinese don't celebrate foreign festivals." And last year, the passing of the new religious regulation was followed by close down of some prominent house churches. Many churches face greater difficulties in securing larger space for worship. Their primary strategy is to split into smaller groups. In some regions, there has been increased harassment and persecution by local authorities. But overall, the effects and ramifications of the new religious regulations are still unfolding. At the end of part 1, I want to emphasize the importance of worship space. It is very central to our understanding of the situation in China facing Christians. We can see that the disintegration of tightly monitored rural communes and urban danwei system have given way to more free space for people to assemble. But because China's reform is a gradualist approach in nature, and many key resources are still owned or defined by the state, there is a certain fuzziness about the rights to use these space. So in general, in the past 2 to 3 decades, Christians have more space to assemble and practice their faith, but there's no guarantee for such rights. And since last year, the new religious regulations seem to put a cap to how big church membership size can grow, and that is becoming an issue. There has been also rising fear and anxiety, especially since last year, among church leaders and China observers, about whether China is regressing to Mao's time. I have been asked this question many times too. My reply would be that we need to consider many parameters other than just the seeming comeback of tighter communist ideological control. As I try to show here, even under the same communist rule, there can be qualitatively different forms of communisms. Other parameters to consider include China's further integration into the global economy, although not without barriers. Most importantly, the regime's legitimacy depends on economic performance, and it needs a vibrant private economic sector to ensure its growth. The same private economic sector will supply space for freedom of assembly and other opportunities. Another reality to consider is that the vast majority of church groups exist with less visible sizes, like under 50. But even under the current situation, including tighter censorship, technology still provides opportunities for Christians to connect and share resources. And under this climate, there can still be more creative ways to form worship communities. In the case of one church's closed down, they adopted later on a walking worship Sunday program. Members in adjacent neighborhoods can walk or jog together while listening to the sermon on a smartphone using a headphone device. After the sermon, they can find somewhere to sit or eat and fellowship. This way, church members get connected in a deeper and more meaningful way. And if we zoom out a little bit and look at the history of Protestant mission in China, you will find a cyclical pattern. After popular reception of the Christian message and the growth of the church, there usually followed a resistance phase, either by popular anti-foreign sentiments or by regime intolerance. It is true, though, that we are witnessing the sixth restrictive phase, but it might not look as intense as the previous cycles, and I personally think that we need to patiently wait for time to tell. Next, I will share about part 2, living as Christian communities in an urbanizing China. In the past 3 decades, China had undergone a hyper-urbanization. What took the West to accomplish in centuries happened for China in a much compressed time span. The speed and scale have been mind-boggling. For example, since 2000s, China alone has used nearly half of the world's cement supplies to form urban infrastructure. And now more than 100 cities have a population exceeding 1 million. I think the number is still growing. The challenges for Christians to live in these growing urban space are quite similar to that of living in other urban societies. And these challenges include materialism, the pressure of living up to certain standards, an achievement culture, over competitiveness, social apathy, overwork, lack of job security, and transient social relationships, etc. But because China's reform has been a gradualist one, people also live with double yokes of residual socialist identities while immersing in capitalistic enterprises. Urban life and political loyalty both demands and define people's identity and loyalty, even to Christians, and they may feel included and excluded at the same time. Compared to other countries, China's urbanization has been accompanied by an even more acute enlarging wealth gap. Issues of urban poverty cannot be ignored, but churches are often slow to respond to this crisis. As this graph shows, the year 2008 marked a watershed year for China and the world, when the percentage of urban residents has taken over that of the rural residents. The ramifications of this for China include the desolation of rural churches and the increasingly stratified urban churches along homogeneous professional lines. In particular, Christian professionals in urban China face some unique challenges. The majority of them are first-generation believers who face great parental pressure in not just choosing the faith to have a new, different religious faith, and in job choices, marriage, child rearing, and committing to church life. So it's very common to see family conflicts rise after the conversion. And because the older generation lived through a drastically different China and thus have high expectations for their only child. And conversion to the Christian faith can better anchor young people in a social Darwinistic urban environment, but church life with its challenges can also disturb that peace. Older generations of leaders are used to a paternalistic model to run the church, while young people have increased rights awareness as individuals. For the younger generation of leaders, the pressure of secular credentialism may pressure them to base their authority on spiritual credentialism. Because of time constraint, I can't give more examples, just describing the patterns. Lastly, because many church groups themselves lack legitimacy and legal status and face constraints, their reaction to social injustice has been similar to the rest of the population, one of social apathy. Churches can become very insulated groups that primarily care for themselves. Charity work is done by some conscientious individual believers. And I've also observed that sometimes Christian NGO workers can become misfits in their churches too. There's one example of Christians caring for a marginalized population, which is migrant workers. And the example is actress Yuan Li. She left acting at the height of her career to advocate for migrant workers who suffer from an occupational lung disease caused by working in a high-dust environment, such as jewelry factories, construction sites, and mines. She once gave a public speech at a top university confessing that her once privileged life as a celebrity actress used to make her utterly indifferent to the suffering of migrants. She used to own many brand name jewelry and liked to boast about them. But after she became a Christian, she started to see these people as equals. Yuan has also founded her own foundation to do advocacy and provide financial support for migrants to get treatment. Her efforts against socioeconomic injustice are among the very few Christian witnesses that gain publicity on China's state media. To summarize, in a competitive and often disorienting urban environment, Chinese Christians face many opportunities to witness their faith in professional and public circles, but the challenges of materialism, credentialism, and the need of reconciliation within the family and across the wealth gap remain. Next, I'll move on to part three, the last part, which is about how to walk the narrow path in a tighter China. Given the time constraint we have today, I want to maybe offer a conceptual tool in understanding the current context of Chinese society and its challenges for Christians. It is true that Christians are marginalized in today's China, but given the socioeconomic opportunities provided by its market economy, such marginalization is uneven across various spheres. This is what I mean by uneven marginality. What I classify as high marginalization are spheres that have more restrictions for Christians to freely express and practice their faith. In first, this refers to the lack of legal status, which remains a hurdle for many churches. And also in the political and legal spheres, many people who work jobs in the public sector, such as military government, judicial, public education system, public health system, it is very hard for these individuals to identify themselves as Christians and still keep the job. Recent years, for example, there are more and more public universities that terminate contracts with faculty members who are active Christians. And this high marginality also shows on state-controlled media, because on state-controlled media, Christianity remains a strictly censored term, and you rarely see them on state media. And in the middle column, medium marginalization are spheres that allow for Christian representation. In social and cultural spheres, for example, Christians have a high social network visibility. This means that it is common for people these days in China to know Christians in their social networks, their social circles. Although the cultural climate may fluctuate by season, for example, Christmas in these recent years have become a time for more hostile sentiments from the public targeting Christians. And on the internet and social media, Christians have access to technology that aids their expression of faith. The restrictions are censorship, which targets all groups, not just Christians. So I consider internet and social media as where Christian representation face only medium level marginalization. I have a special note on internet censorship in China. I know that our mind tends to get nervous at the fact that nowadays digital technology has assisted the Chinese regime to become like a huge Orwellian surveillance state. But a few facts can help ease that kind of sometimes becomes paranoid. First and most important thing, the Chinese regime is not a coherent wheel or like a giant brain taking information, act on these collected data. Instead, it's a sophisticated human system with human flaws. If you check out from the library a few, excuse me, most up-to-date scholarly works on China's censorship, you'll be surprised to find two things. First, this huge system of censorship, aided by technology, have become so all-encompassing but less effective than you might think because of the flaws in processing this information. And secondly, cyber citizens have become more creative in bypassing censorship. Just like the example I gave you about walking worship program, it shows how people can be creative and kind of come up with new ways to fight against the system almost. This is not to say that we should be ignorant to censorship when you're serving churches in China. I think a right term or attitude might be called informed alertness. Try to be alert when you share information, especially thinking of others who are in China when you connect them, like say via WeChat. It's not the perfect tool to use, but you have to use it sometimes. And try to diversify communication tools to fragment one project via different platforms or tools. These are just ways to maximize the convenience of technology while minimizing the harm it might have. And the last one is about spheres that have Christians face low level of marginalization, which is the economic sphere, particularly the private economic sector. Christians can now still freely register businesses, become like factory owners, or start a publishing company. Some faith-based NGOs and private education institutions that are faith-based also operate by using business registration policies that are available in the Chinese business laws. So there is almost maximum possibility in the private economic sector. On a more specific level, here's how these parameters of these spheres come up to. When we ask whether or not some people in China have the freedom to choose their religious faith, this really depends on which sector that person works for. For example, in the public sector, it's very hard for this basic religious freedom to exist. But for Christians in other working environment, there's a lot of freedom. And secondly, when we ask whether or not people can assemble and practice their faith and beliefs collectively as a group, the same rationale applies. It's harder for people who are working in the public sector to do that. And lastly, when we ask whether or not Christians in China can form a sizable church and freely assemble, depending on location, this has become difficult for large-sized church groups to congregate in one location. Again, the concept of worship space is very, very key to this. But smaller size groups have a lot of freedom. And given this conceptual tool, even with this tool in China, I think you should always prepare for exceptions. For example, 2 weeks ago, a friend in Beijing sent me a video showing their retreat in a huge facility. She is the founder of a children and youth ministry, and they rented a stadium for the annual retreat right in Beijing. I was very surprised to know that they could still do that. But that's probably the convenience of the economic sector that these spaces are still available. What the private economic sector allows is spontaneity, creativity, and fluidity. These certainly help churches even in today's climate. Lastly, I want to share about how to talk about persecution in China. In the Chinese language, there's a range of terms that can be used when referring to different levels of government intervention. First, there's inconvenience, 麻烦不方便. For example, if a local police asks a pastor to go in for tea, that means 喝茶, is it persecution? Is it a friendly gesture? Neither of these. It's a gesture of saying you are being watched and you need to cooperate. That pastor doesn't enjoy drinking tea with the police or the authorities because it's a nuisance. So 很麻烦, 很讨厌. But that is still a level of intervention from the authorities. The second word is harassment, 骚扰. For example, a Sunday service was interrupted and local authorities came in to register every member's ID and then they left. Is it persecution? Harassment is probably a better term to describe it. There, a certain order has been interrupted, but the service was not completely stopped. And the next level of intervention is pressuring. The local authorities might ask the landlord to terminate the lease of an apartment to a church group. There's no confrontation, it's through a third-party pressuring gesture. This church group can find another lease and leave this current location. So pressure, 施压, 给压力 is a better term. Another example is like a public university faculty is demanded to quit going to his church with no specific penalty. You just can't go there. Don't stop going there. And that is pressure too. And the next two terms, suppression, 打压, and persecution, 逼迫, are more severe cases where violence and usually violence and physical confinement are involved. So again, as I have said, while not everything we hear about would be considered persecution because of the Christian faith, there is still evidence that the frequency of all these forms of interference have been increasing. And I also have to add that whatever the level experienced, we should keep our brothers and sisters in our prayers. To conclude this presentation, I hope to repeat the takeaway message. First is that our understanding of circumstances facing Christians in China need to consider not just the political, but also the socio-economic structural parameters. And second, China defies generalization. While noticing some general trends, we still ought to analyze the context case by case. This is the end of my presentation. I really appreciate your participation, and I will be happy to take some questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary, for that informative presentation. Before we begin the question and answer period, I'm going to do the second poll. And so if you can just take a few minutes here to answer the second poll, what would help you better to engage and serve with the church in China? So you can go ahead and mark your responses, and after a few seconds, I'll close it. Okay, now we're going to move on to the question and answer part of the presentation. And I just have a couple of things I want to say here. While we answer the questions, we're going to keep this slide up that has information, our contact information for ChinaSource, as well as the email contact information for Mary and myself. We also invite you to subscribe to ZG Briefs and other ChinaSource material you can find at chinasource.org. I'd like to highlight ZG Briefs, which is our weekly roundup of news coming out of China. That would be great. You can continue to stay informed. So let's dive into some of the questions that we received during the time that Mary was talking. And I will say up front, too, that if we run out of time during this question and answer session to get to all the questions that you have submitted, we will follow up with you afterwards to respond. We're committed to trying to answer every question that you submitted during this webinar. So thank you for doing that. The first question, Mary, is about social stratification. Can you give examples of how social stratification affects urban churches?
Thank you. That's a great question. Social stratification means that, so we know that Chinese church is very status-based, sensitive society, and church structures tend to reflect the social structure in the society. Like what I mean by that is churches tend to become very homogeneous. For example, a church that was started by a medical doctor, and because he relied on high trust, close-knit network to bring people to the church, this church tends to become a church of medical professionals, nurses and doctors in that system or neighborhood. And churches that are made up of university faculty members tend to be faculty members and their students, occasionally some other people in their social networks. It's because many churches are closed systems that rely on very high trust network to recruit. And that becomes a problem because of lack of diversity. Migrant churches are just migrant churches. There's a certain pattern of segregation almost. The only exception when does a church become diversified is when the church opens up to its adjacent neighborhoods and bring people from their physical neighbors to church. But not many churches do that because of a lot of safety security concerns. Well, Three South churches tend to have more diversity, in fact, and because it's wide in the open. So there are many factors, leadership or recruitment mechanisms, preferences of leaders. Just yeah, in general, that's how churches also become stratified.
Okay, thanks, Mary. That was a great answer. Um, the second question is, do you see more people from the Three Self churches or from the house churches trying to get involved in issues of social justice?
Right. For me personally, my observation, Three South churches, it depends on what you define as social justice ministries. I think neither of these groups tend to do that. A lot of faith-based NGOs started by members of these churches do that, but on the church level, very few, except they care for the needy people in their midst. But in terms of outreaching to a certain group, um, mostly are done by Christian NGO workers.
Okay, great. Thank you. We've had a couple of questions regarding technology, specifically WeChat. I think you mentioned that WeChat today has become the primary tool that Chinese use to communicate with one another, and I think a lot of Westerners who either live in China or interact with China have found that if we're going to build relationships and stay connected with Chinese friends, we really have to be on WeChat. But there's also a lot of anxiety surrounding WeChat because of the reports that we hear of government monitoring, and you alluded to that a little bit. But could you just speak to those people who have Chinese friends and they want to stay connected with WeChat, but they're really not quite sure how much to talk about? Are there sort of topics that you should absolutely not talk about on WeChat? What are some guidelines for those of us as we use WeChat?
Right. Thank you. I probably shared a little bit about, yeah, I think one thing is something you cannot avoid, especially their meaningful content that are being passed around. And if you know Chinese enough and then the language enough, and then if you catch like conversations that people are having. There are many self-publishing that the Christians are doing through WeChat public IDs or their personal IDs. Just a lot of content. It's almost like a public sphere for Christians, but highly monitored or fully entirely monitored, I should say. So I think the strategy is to be creative and be aware, be alert about maximizing the convenience but minimizing the harm. What I would suggest are the tips I just gave. Try to diversify the tools you use. If you really want to have like, you can keep WeChat connections as like you're an observer and you're just observing what people are sharing. But when you really want to have a conversation, I would advise switching to another communication tool and try to diversify even for one project. If you are having one conversation, try to fragment. I'm sure this will be monitored while we're speaking. But you have to kind of trick the game, fragment the conversation or fragment the project by using multiple tools. Kind of, I can only say that. I have to be alert about that.
Sure. Would you? Yeah, I think you commented earlier something about alertness is a good idea, and I think we all walk that line between how do you be alert without crossing into the into the realm of paranoia. Would you say this restriction or this monitoring of WeChat also applies to the audio and the video functions as well?
Um, I would be cautious about all forms of two-way communication on WeChat. But if it's only like observing what people are sharing and just, and in the moments, 朋友圈 and all these, I think, well, and also you can kind of tell what posts or what content are being deleted right away, and that means they've hit some sensitive buttons. So
Right.
ongoing, very fluid and very dynamic things. If
Yeah.
you want me ask me to list all the sensitive terms, it'll take forever because they update the list too, I think.
Yes, I think they do as well. Um, Somebody asked again, because we're on this topic of WeChat, what is the best way to ask a Chinese person for their contact information? My experience is when I meet a Chinese person and, I mention I'm on WeChat, they just sort of automatically whip out their phones and say, oh, let's connect, even though I might have just met them. What's the best way for us to handle that as we meet Chinese, maybe here in the US or in Australia or in, wherever we are in the world or in China?
Right.
What's the best way to handle that?
Um, right. I think like all kinds, all other, even before WeChat became the dominant tool, I mean, whether or not to initiate and maintain a relationship with one person, like it's a trust issue. If you trust this person enough, if you know this, I think connecting on WeChat, is fine. Like, and then, but my personal preference is to keep the circle separate. I have a different WeChat ID to connect with the closest. Like, so even when you try to connect with different Chinese individuals, try to differentiate the circles and group them maybe on several different WeChat IDs. Because the thing is that with big data technology, like these people do like social network analysis using using some tools. It's easy. You as a foreigner might become a hub of other individuals. So you never know that you might. My concept of being alert, the alertness is that yes, try to be alert about the potential harm you might do to the other person. If this WeChat ID is connected to this like big high profile pastor, and then you connect other Chinese individuals to the same WeChat ID, I would not do that. So I mean, what I mean is that diversify your social contacts by terms of high risk and low risk almost. I would tend to do that, but it becomes really complicated.
It becomes complicated, and I think those of us who interact with China know that pretty much everything in China is complicated. Um, yeah, I know. I met some Chinese folks in the Twin Cities last week, and they're like, "Oh, WeChat," and then they're like, "You need to be careful." I said, "Don't worry. I never set up a group, and I only use WeChat to, say happy birthday to somebody."
Right.
And that's pretty much.
So right, yeah, low risk content and low, like almost like not deep conversations. Deep
Sure.
conversation and high risk content cannot be shared on WeChat. So
Right.
diversify the content and the tools.
Right. So I think that's really good advice. It's not, maybe we shouldn't be asking, should we use WeChat or should we not use WeChat?
Or how?
We just have to use it with absolutely
Right.
low risk types of conversation. What types of things are we going to talk about on WeChat and what types of things are we not? And obviously political is completely off limits. Um, okay, this seems to be the hot topic here. How is it possible to have multiple WeChat IDs if they're linked to your mobile phone number?
Oh.
You have multiple phones?
Uh, well, oh, actually, well, when it was not by real name, I used to have multiple phones. But
Oh,
this is really, I can't share much on this because my husband manages our accounts, so I don't know how it works on that.
okay. But multiple phones is, of course,
Yes,
one way
definitely.
to get around that. Okay, thanks. Yeah, this is a great conversation about about WeChat and communication, and I know that that many people, in this audience are people who work with Chinese on a regular basis, and they're very, very. This is a big issue for us. I want to just turn to your talking about the restrictive phrases, and I'm wondering, you said this is the sixth restrictive phrase, and so the question that's come through is how do you see this restrictive phrase being different from past anti-religious or anti-Christian campaigns?
Well, I think just what I have already presented, the economic reality that China is in. Of course, I know with the trade war and all these barriers, but China has been integrated into the global economy in a much deeper way than before. And technology is almost like an umbilical cord too that you can't cut. And so the integration, there's no way that a country of this size can seal its borders and retreat to its own like before. Because just check all the previous phases. That's what they did. Cut off the ties and then become self-independent. It's not possible anymore. Although I can't predict, but I tend to think that it's really hard just because the regime legitimacy is based on economic performance, and that's their primary goal to keep the growth rate and keep the engine going. Otherwise, nobody wants to see a downturn. And although there's hidden crisis too, so on that level, and also on how connected people are with the outside world, international travel and exchange and all these. So yeah, that's my judgment.
Okay, thank you. Can you comment on the Chinese Christians being involved in doing cross-cultural missions to other nations in the context of the both the greater surveillance and the government's Belt and Road Initiative? Is this opening? Is the Belt and Road opening more doors for Chinese to be involved in missions, but maybe the surveillance is going to make it harder? I don't know. What are you seeing in that area?
Right. Yes. Thank you for this question. It's very interesting and new area for me too. And I've been to conferences with African scholars, and they told me incidents that they were surprised that so many Chinese churches are sprouting in Africa. And of course, I've heard about cross-cultural mission work to the Middle East too by the Chinese. And I think cross-cultural mission is on the rise from churches in China because they see it as a sign of maturity for a church to send out cross-cultural missionaries. But I don't think churches are prepared for that, given the understanding of theology and cross-cultural. You need kind of cross-cultural intelligence to do cross-cultural mission. And I think the nationalistic sentiments kind of gave fuel to that too. Like other mission movements in around the world, they a lot of times were combined with nationalism. So I'm more concerned than optimistic about this part of the development. But I'm doing right now, working on a project about this. I haven't. It's hard to put it into one statement or two. It's an interesting phenomenon, and it's very concerning given the nationalistic sentiments embraced by Christian groups too.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot of rumors and stories in our press, at least in the United States here, about a state-translated Bible that they're working on that's going to, be socialist in its language. Do you know if that's just a rumor at this point, or is that something that the China Christian Council's religious affairs apparatus is actually working on?
Right. As far as this question is concerned, I'm sorry. Excuse me. I have not followed up with this, but I don't think at this point it has materialized to the degree that we could see the result. And
Right.
there are many, many ongoing Bible translation, different versions of Bible translation projects. And there's always like you have an editing content editing process, and you have another distribution process, marketing. So just changing the content won't make it automatically popular because then people have to buy it. So I'm not very pessimistic about this. I don't think I think it'll be a waste of things.
So you think they might actually try to do it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will be accepted by Christians.
I don't think
Okay.
no.
Okay. Um, can you talk about how public trust in government impacts the receptiveness to the gospel? Is there a correlation between the political climate and church growth
Oh,
historically?
um, I think there was in the early 90s. Yeah, there was a great disillusionment among the public, and then there was a spiritual revival. All kinds of religions revived, and including Christianity. So there was, but the correlation might not be linear. There might be other. Right now, or if we're talking about this phase, I don't think there is a direct correlation between these two, because we are actually seeing a lot of attrition from the church. What I mean by attrition means people who quit the church or leave the church, and along with growth, that's another thing. So um, it's not a linear correlation between these two.
Okay, so over the last number of decades, we've often heard about this explosive church growth, and your chart that you put on earlier, I think, was a good visual representation of that. There's just been a general trend line up.
Mhm.
Is it your belief then that we may be plateauing in terms of church growth, and maybe heading into a period of declining church, maybe not declining church participation, but slowing down or declining church growth?
I think I heard from many ministry leaders and church leaders that, for example, the growth was like in the urban space was predominantly on college campuses and college students, and who later became urban professionals. And it's definitely much harder to do outreach to college students these days, and definitely a plateau phase, I think.
Hmm. Okay, that's interesting, and probably useful information for many of the people who are listening to this presentation tonight. We are going to stop there, and again, I just want to reiterate that we were not able to get to all of the questions that were posed, but we have them archived, and so we are committed to following up with each one of you who submitted a question, and we will hopefully get a timely response to you, but we will be answering those questions in the coming days for you. So again, thank you so much for joining us.